dramaturgy points us towards is we need to look at the context. So what does the stage of the drama look like? And what does the audience look like? In the case of, just to play out the Al-Qaeda piece, the context is various repressive governmental regimes in the Middle East that had strong dictatorial tendencies, that tended to have really high inequality, and basically had kind of been left behind at some level other parts of the world in terms of economic development and different freedoms. So you have this kind of these horrific political contexts, and at the same time, by the time our decade hits of the 2000s, you've had 40 or 50 years of attempts by different Islamic groups to try and reform Islamic teaching in the context that I just mentioned of the political inequality and oppression. And so already outside of normal authority structures in Islam, you have these groups operating that are coming up with ideas of what Islam should be. And Osama bin Laden basically became a strong follower of these Islamic tendencies that are way outside the mainstream of Islam, way outside of existing authority structures. But these ideas had been floating around for a while in this context, and so something that bin Laden was able to latch onto. And then finally, if we think in terms of this dramaturgy idea, we have to think about the actors. So if this is kind of the parts of the play and the plot of the play, and this is the audience, then what is it about the actors that have them engaged in using politics for religious reasons? Well, there are some very strong ideological ideas. You'll remember a lot of times you see stuff in the news about these death tapes where people have a suicide vest or a gun and they'll claim that they're going to meet virgins in heaven, that sort of thing. It's really unclear how important those sorts of ideas are. But they are definitely part of the dramaturgy. They're definitely part of trying to express to the world what a motivation is, whether those motivations are really sociologically responsible for people becoming involved in this sort of violence. What are some important sociological motivators, though, if you will, motivating the actors, is the isolation that a lot of these actors have, the social isolation in terms of poverty or in terms of being part of elite classes. And oftentimes these are men who haven't had marriages or don't have the economic basis in order to kind of integrate into traditional community structures, and so they're fairly isolated. But then they also find strong solidarity in the religious groups they're involved in. So there's this tension between a kind of social isolation, but then kind of solidarity that wraps them into their groups. There is many of these individuals, whether they're poor or rich, educated or not, that are involved in this sort of violence, have strong senses of lacking power, efficacy. Markets have repressed in terms of all sorts of kind of social situations by repressive regimes in the Middle East. And so there's a strong sense of lacking efficacy. So when you find a group that has a vision and has ability, even if it's violent, to express that vision, then that provides a real strong sense of efficacy. And then finally, they're also motivated by what we see as evidence of this out threat or this actually taking place in our day and time. So a lot of times you'll hear in Al-Qaeda literature discussions of being mad about American military forces being in the Middle East, or kind of American culture about women that's infiltrating the Middle East and this sort of thing. So you have these motivations of where the actors are continually kind of re-encountering that which they detest in the world, and so therefore can kind of re-amplify their motivation all over again. Okay, so this is the first reading, using politics for religious readings. Now let's, for religious reasons. Now let's flip over to Thursday's reading, which is still about religion and violence, but is using religion for political reasons. So kind of the opposite side of the coin. And here again, our concept of dramaturgy helps us out. If we think again in terms of kind of the context, which is the audience, the actors, and then the kind of plot stage, if you will. And the plot and stage in this reading that we do for Thursday, which is about Iranian tactics in the Iraq-Iran War of the 1980s. The plot, the stage, is basically an attempt by the Ayatollah in Iran to consolidate power. Let me write this in black so you can see it. So in the early 1980s, there was all sorts of crisis in Iran, and so being engaged in a war is one way for a leader to consolidate power. And there was really kind of a lack of resources at the time in Iran, literally in terms of military resources and ability to fight battles and to win battles in a classic military way against Iraq. And then this is all kind of shrouded, if you will, in the idea of a revolutionary Islamic republic that came to power in really 1979, 1980. And so that's kind of the stage that sets this. And you have the then kind of ongoing conflict with their neighbor Iraq, which had a variety of reasons that it was involved in. But one of the things it served to do for both Iraq and Iranian leadership was to try and consolidate power. The audience then for the violence that we read about in this reading, it's both external and internal. So the audience is to try and shock Iraqi troops to shoot child soldiers. And it's also kind of show the world, if you will, the faith that the people of Iran have in their leader and supportive they are of these children, supposedly. But then internally, there's clearly an audience here, which is the Ayatollah and the Iranian leadership trying to basically show people within the society that they have to sacrifice for society and that they will be coerced, if you will, to do so. So then it brings us kind of to the question in terms of religion and violence. So what about the actors? Well, in these cases, it looks like the motivation of the actors, these children walking as cannon fodder out into minefields and in front of machine gunners, the motivation is coercion. It's not brainwashing, if you will. These students these young people are taken from their schools, from their families. They're isolated. They're promised all sorts of glorious, wonderful things in terms of friends and food and that sort of thing. But by being taken away and being isolated and having their own families threatened if they don't engage in this activity, clearly they are incredibly coerced. And then finally, another piece of motivation is that during this whole time, Iran was engaged in reinterpretation of Scripture. So as the reading talks about, there are some reference points in Islamic Scripture that the Ayatollah and his cronies go back to again and again to try and beef up the motivation of the actors, if you will, to try and give a religious vision to what is actually a political move, which is putting child soldiers out as kind of last-ditch violent efforts to try and win a war. So let me leave it there for right now. I kind of covered quite a bit, but hopefully you can get the forest for the trees, this idea of different ways to think about religion and violence. One, using kind of the dramaturgy and symbolic boundaries concept. One way is to think about these groups of persons as religious groups that then use politics for religious reasons. Another way is to look at religion as a resource, if you will, in basically what seems to be more of kind of a political context or a military context. So that's it for all. That's the lecture for this week. Looking forward to next week and next week's lecture where we really get to talk about the resources that are part of kind of positive attempts for religion and social change. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.